You're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin. Question for you. What do you know about Azerbaijan? Chances are, not much. Larry King was actually there recently, and this is how he described it to Jimmy Kimmel.
Azerbaijan, you know where it is?
No.
Well, I didn't know where it was either. My wife and I, we flew to London, which is enough. That's 9.5 hours.
Right.
And then I figured, Azerbaijan, how far could that be from London, right? 5 hours to Azerbaijan. It was endless in the air. But Azerbaijan is an incredible city. It's an oil city. It's south of Moscow, about 4 hours south of Moscow. It's somewhere out there.
Yeah, right.
And they have modern hotels, the city on hills, beautiful city. And I did a lot of, I've been to Kazakhstan, Lisbon, Seoul, South Korea, moderating comedy. I've been doing a lot of speaking. I did comedy tours.
Yeah, I know you did the comedy tour. But
all right, so you get the point. He said it's a city with modern hotels. No, actually, Baku is the capital. That's the city. Azerbaijan is an oil-rich country that borders Iran, where about 10 million ethnic Azeris live in the north, in Iran. That's actually more than the population of Azerbaijan itself. Now, while the country is widely hailed as westernized and secular as compared to Iran's repressive regime, in reality, Azerbaijan is repressive, even if it embraces J-Lo, Rihanna, and Shakira, who have all visited to perform and titillate crowds as it angles for closer ties with the West. But Azerbaijan is actually descending into authoritarianism, and many accuse the country's president, Aliyev, who took power in 2003 after a fraud-filled election, of committing grave human rights abuses. Now, joining me to discuss Azerbaijan is, and its global relevance is Mark Perry. He's a writer and analyst at Foreign Policy. We also have Shireen Sadeghi, a journalist covering international news, and Taufiq Rahim, a Dubai-based political analyst who's traveled to the country recently and who's joining us by the phone. Now, Taufiq, why don't we start with you? What is the significance and relevance of Azerbaijan as it pertains to Iran and the globe?
Well, Azerbaijan is of geostrategic importance for those two reasons that you just mentioned in your description of the country. It borders Iran, and that's significant, partially because it does also share those ethnic links with the Azeri population. And then, of course, it's a petrol-rich country, so it's important from an energy perspective. Now, I went to Azerbaijan at kind of a nebulous invitation of a symposium of international relations scholars organized by the Office of the President. And they tried to give kind of a positive snapshot of the country. But I think it's interesting what Larry King said, because he called Azerbaijan a city, and of course he didn't travel outside Baku, where there are actually tremendous pockets of poverty amidst this Dubai-esque building boom that has happened in the capital. Including in that boom has been also a wave of authoritarianism, which I think you rightly mentioned, in which there's been a crackdown on activists, including a personal friend of mine who Hillary Clinton, when on her visit to the country, ensured was released, and that is Bakhtiar Hajiev. And so that was a little bit of a trade to facilitate Hillary Clinton's visit with the kind of emancipation of a human rights activist. But in the grand scheme of things, Azerbaijan is a little bit like a launching point for subversive activity into Iran. Because of this situation with Armenia, which is a neighboring country and a state of war, Azerbaijan looks for external assistance to its military and defense capabilities. And so they've had a little bit of a soft and even growing relationship with Israel and cooperation over the years. So there's a lot of little entry points in Azerbaijan that makes it a very interesting place, and it's obviously also a very quixotic and eccentric place, as Larry King's excerpt was alluding to.
Well, thank you for that. That was actually a very good contextualizing preface for this conversation. Mark, I have to ask you, he touched on the relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan. In your recent piece right here, Israel's Secret Staging Ground, you actually say U.S. officials believe that Israelis have gained access to air bases in Azerbaijan. Could you extrapolate a little bit about the close ties between Israel and Azerbaijan and what is really at stake there?
The close ties have been going on for quite some time. For at least 10 or 15 years, there have been visits from top Israeli officials to Azerbaijan, including the defense minister. Prime ministers have met with top Azeri officials, Azerbaijan officials. There are close military ties. There have even, as I explained in the article, Israeli officials have gained access, Israeli military officials have gained access to Azerbaijan air bases for use in any projected upcoming military adventure. All of this, of course, denied by Israel. Perhaps most importantly, the two most important things we should keep in mind is that oil that is taken out of the ground in Azerbaijan, it's their most important aspect, most important export, is put into a pipeline across Azerbaijan into Turkey, offloaded and exported and sold to Israel. And recently, Israel has set up, established a very robust drone production facility in Azerbaijan. We can only guess what its use would be for, but since Azerbaijan borders Iran, we could guess that those drones would be used in any possible adventuresome war by Israel against Iran.
And Mark, that's part of, you know, $1 billion arms deal between the countries. We understand that the drones are Israeli designed, and presumably, as you are implying, they could be used in the event of an Israeli strike for surveillance, for, you know, a myriad number of things. I do want to quickly interject with a comment coming in from W.T. Effington saying, are there any U.S. oil companies in Azerbaijan? You know, we did a little bit of research. We understand that, you know, Azerbaijan has 7 billion barrels in proven reserves of oil, and they output, I believe, 1 million per day. They work with BP, they work with ExxonMobil. So I guess the short answer then, Mark, is yes?
We have good relations with Azerbaijan. The United States is not known for shying away from having relations with countries that are single-party dictatorships. In this case, we don't shy away from it. ExxonMobil, and as you mentioned, BP have a relationship with Azerbaijan. We go where the oil is, regardless of the political feelings of the government. We have a pretty good relationship with that government. They have a good representation here in Washington, D.C. It's a little bit of an embarrassment, but a little bit of an embarrassment never stopped us.
Well, I'm glad you made that point and that you're being very transparent about it. I do appreciate it, because the truth is, if you look at my screen, we have this article that just broke on October 18th. Representative Royce blasts the Washington Post for its Azerbaijan coverage. Essentially, Shireen, this was about the fact that we are hailing it as Western and secular, based seemingly only on the grounds that Shakira and J-Lo and others can go there and perform without much complaint from the government. You know, the representative saying that's very irresponsible and it's misleading. What's your read on Azerbaijan's significance and the cozying up to Israel?
I think that I'm very interested in the media coverage. I'm glad you brought up that statement by Representative Royce. The media coverage with Washington Post headlines saying that tiny little Azerbaijan is taking on the mullahs, and a number of similar headlines and texts like that is a sign of desperation, I think, by the media in the U.S. particularly, and by extension their authoritative sources in the U.S. government. There is frustration with Iran, but to frame it as Azerbaijan taking on Iran is just completely inaccurate. As Mark stated, and the previous caller stated as well, Azerbaijan is a one-party dictatorship. The man who is in office right now is the son of the man who was in office before him. His election in 2003 was highly contested. They have severe human rights issues, including abuse of political prisoners, very serious issues with the imprisonment of media officials and journalists, and they do not have, just because J-Lo showed up and wiggled her behind does not mean that they have a great deal of respect for women's rights. It might actually mean quite the opposite, to be frank. So I think that this narrative in the media is very misleading, and I think it's important that you're doing this segment and that you're bringing that point out.
Well, I appreciate that, Shireen. I do want to quickly mention, Taufiq, I want to get your take on what Shireen spoke about, but I think that, you know, I would be remiss not to share with you a report done by the United Nations that touches on some of what is at stake and the complaints around human rights violations in Azerbaijan. Take a look at this.
town. This is Baku, Azerbaijan's capital on the Caspian Sea. Vast oil reserves are fueling massive construction and a drastic reduction in poverty. Good news for some, but for others it's brought terror right into the home.
Don't do it! I'm standing here! Scum! Don't do this! Stop!
This is eviction Baku style. Police officers and city workers surround a building and smash their way into an apartment owned by Nuria Khalikova. She captures what happens on her small camera.
So, as you may know, Taufiq, the video, I know maybe you couldn't see the images, but it showed a contrast of, modernity, but then also property rights and evictions. Perhaps, something that we're not accustomed to seeing in Israel. I just wonder, do you think that this actually has any significance when it comes to whether Western countries are willing to, ally with Azerbaijan?
Well, I'll give you kind of a more analytic view and then a personal view on this. I mean, on the analytic side, when the revolutions were happening, and this is under George W. Bush's tenure, when he's much more forcibly promoting freedom and democracy, when the revolutions were happening in Ukraine and, the support for Viktor Yushchenko and then for Saakashvili in Georgia, and then in Kyrgyzstan, when they were bringing down Aliyev, and you had these, Orange Revolution and Tulip Revolutions, when the Azerbaijanis started to demonstrate, they were abandoned. And as you noted and Shireen noted, Ilham Aliyev went through a fraudulent election, and it was supported by the West at the very time that they were promoting democracy in all the surrounding countries in the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. So this is actually nothing new, and I think the report that you pointed out that I couldn't, unfortunately, see the footage is not new. Obviously, I think it becomes difficult if you believe in human rights and the respect for the rule of law and the respect for the fundamental dignity of individuals to deal with a country like Azerbaijan. And as I mentioned, one of my classmates who was a senior opposition figure in terms of leading the cause and still is, was tortured in jail at the very time that the U.S. was strengthening a relationship in 2010 and 2011. But I think the broader question it has to be, isn't this the approach of U.S. foreign policy anyways? And we can point to a number of different countries, whether Saudi Arabia, whether and other countries in the Gulf, and Azerbaijan, of course, another one, where geostrategic and energy priorities take precedence over human rights.
That's an interesting point. Mark, I'll put that point to you that Taufiq mentioned just generally in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but bringing it back to Azerbaijan, do you think there's a conflict of interest with the renewed, let's say the alliance between Israel and Azerbaijan and that of the U.S. in Azerbaijan and in trying to mediate the Armenia conflict?
I'm trying to think through an answer here without embarrassing myself.
Why is it embarrassing yourself as an option?
Well, the American foreign policy has always been and always will be to promote American markets and defend American markets. This isn't new. Wherever ExxonMobil goes, there will American foreign policy go. And that's always been true. This isn't a surprise, and it's not a surprise that no one's embarrassed in our government about that. And we've always had to live with the very uncomfortable fact that we will pal up to a government of any way, shape, or form so long as it supports American business, because American foreign policy is American business. The American fleet is in the Persian Gulf because ExxonMobil pulls natural gas out of Qatar. That's why we're there. But I don't think that we should cross the line and say, well, we support the government of Azerbaijan. The truth is, we don't care about the government of Azerbaijan. We care about the oil that's in the ground. And if tomorrow there are demonstrations in downtown Baku and the next day there's a democracy there, we'll make friends with them.
Well, that's a perfect kind of segue into the next point. I mean, the truth is Azerbaijan relies on, I think, for its energy sector for 50% of its GDP. Now, that's a lot, and it's more than 90% of its exports. So you're very right, Mark, to make the point that obviously if oil wasn't there, the U.S. wouldn't be involved. But Is it true then?
Care.
Yeah, is it true then that, their foreign policy is very much, they're very aware of this as well, and they're trying to maximize their oil profits to build their country, and they're using their reserves of oil, obviously, to maintain relationships with the West, with America and Russia, so kind of playing both sides. If oil, for example, was to, slow down in terms of production, and the economy would suffer, you're saying essentially that if there were protests, then America would perhaps not care about this dictator. Is there anything we can do then to pressure our government to care more about the rights of the people in Azerbaijan?
If this were Saudi Arabia and we were totally dependent, if this were Canada, which is where we get most of our energy, it would be a different story altogether. It wouldn't take much pressure at all for us to not care about Azerbaijan. And the fact that Israel is palling up to Azerbaijan and using it as an aircraft carrier in the Middle East to wage a covert war, or not so covert, against Iran, is very disturbing to the American government and especially to the Pentagon. And it wouldn't take very much pressure for us at all to have a different kind of a relationship with Azerbaijan, and I think that's entirely doable.
Could you spell out why that relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan is troubling to the U.S. government? Is it just that they worry this increases the likelihood of a unilateral strike on Iran that then would result in chaos in the region?
That's one thing. But it's one thing to have a strike on Iran and cause chaos in the Persian Gulf. It's another thing to have a strike on Iran and have it cause chaos in the Persian Gulf and in Central Asia. Azerbaijan isn't in the Persian Gulf. It's in Central Asia. And it expands a conflict.
Azerbaijan is in the Caucasus.
That's right. It's not in the Persian Gulf. It expands a potential conflict well beyond the parameters of the Persian Gulf region into a different era altogether. And it might involve Russia, Turkey, the nations of the Caucasus. The whole point of us keeping the lid on a possible strike is to not expand a conflict, but to keep it under control and preferably to not have one at all.
Could I ask you a question, Mark? I mean, I think you're pointing to the repercussions of an Israeli attack on Iran, a wholesale attack, but aren't they using the base in Azerbaijan, and the Mossad is using it to conduct subversive activities like the assassination of scientists and other things that are actually a prelude to an attack, so in which there's less blowback? So why would the Pentagon be opposed to those type of activities being based out of Azerbaijan?
It's not the Pentagon that's opposed. The policy is run from the White House, and I think that there is broad and general opposition in this government and in the Obama administration to any activities that would destabilize this region and that would escalate or lead to a conflict in general between Israel and Iran, because it would involve us.
Well, we understand that with what is the significance then of the Azeris? The population, as I understand it, Taufiq, in Azerbaijan is something like 9 million Azerbaijanis, let's say. In Iran, in the north, as you know, there's over 9 million, near 10 million ethnic Azeris. In the event of a strike, would they then not be worried? Would Azerbaijan not be thinking that perhaps there would be a mass exodus of Azeris into Azerbaijan and they wouldn't be able to withstand that? I mean, is that far-fetched?
Yeah. No, I definitely, I mean, it's the population of Azeris, or, northern Azerbaijanis in Iran is, somewhere between 10 and 15 million. And I believe also Ayatollah Khamenei is actually of Azeri ethnic.
Yes, it's true. Actually, our producer
he's half Iran. He's half Azeri. Half Azeri.
Half
Azeri.
What's the significance of that?
Well, I mean, I do think that there are links and strong links between a number of different leaders, and there are people from within the Green Movement, and I don't want to get it wrong, but I think Keroubi is Azeri, but Shireen can probably correct me.
No, Keroubi is not. Mousavi is Azeri.
Mousavi is Azeri. Okay, so I was mixing up the two. Yeah. But because of those links, I think for Azerbaijan itself, it would be destabilizing if they were involved in a wholesale attack on Iran, because I think their own population would view it suspiciously. And I think the links across the border would perhaps lead to mobilization against Aliyev's government. So I actually don't believe that Azerbaijan is going to be part and parcel of an attack on Iran, but I do think they'll have this kind of co-opted relationship with other types of subterfuge and activities without going in that kind of larger direction because they understand that that would destabilize their own regime.
Right.
I agree with that.
Shireen, I have to ask you, Mark agreed with what Taufiq said just there, but isn't Azerbaijan actually cozying up, let's say, to Israel, you know, having these deals, allowing for the drones to arrive and you know, sending them, you know, crude? Isn't this at the expense of remaining and you know, facilitating and keeping good relations with their own neighbors in the region, in the Caucasus? I mean, is that not important?
We don't know the nature of this Israeli relationship. We're reading about it in the Washington Post, which, as I said, is writing ridiculous headlines about.
Okay, but
J-Lo.
Shireen, let's be honest. We've had, you know, Mark even reported himself, you know, who's joining us on this hangout, that the president's aide said to many people, it's been, you know, quoted multiple places, that the relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan is 9/10 under the surface. It's like an iceberg that's 9/10 under the surface, leading us to believe that there is perhaps even a closer relationship than appears in the Washington Post or any paper for that matter.
There may well be, but the point is that when it comes to Iran and Israel, the interests of the United States government currently under this administration are that all activity remain under the surface, to be that 90% of the iceberg that's under the surface. They don't want overt tensions. I should point out that while there are 10 million Azeris in the state of Azerbaijan and Iran, there are estimated to be around 30% of the entire Iranian population, which now consists of about 72 million people, to be Azeri. There's a lot more than 10 million Azeris in Iran, but for Iranians, Azeris are not some distinct minority. They're Iranians. As we said, the supreme leader is half Azeri. The leader of the Green Revolution is Azeri. This isn't seen as like some kind of a marginalized minority in Iran. They are Iranians. And Iranians have a close relationship with them. It's very easy for Iranians to travel from Iran to Azerbaijan and vice versa,
Shireen,
and they do that. They vacation
Shireen,
there. So we need to.
Go ahead, finish your point.
So the point is that even if Azerbaijan is in some kind of a relationship with Israel, they do realize that they need to tread carefully, because even if their governments are not getting along, if Iran and Azerbaijan are maybe not getting along, which is not entirely the case, the people have a strong connection. That's something they can't overlook.
Well, as you know, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been involved in a lengthy dispute for many years over the Nagorno-Karabakh, a region located actually entirely within Azerbaijan territory. But Shireen, my point was, you know, choosing to have good relations with Israel, let's assume that that is true, at a time when they have ongoing disputes with Iran, with Georgia, with Turkey, with Turkmenistan, all these countries that are in the region. I mean, Mark, it seems to me, I don't know too much about leading a country, but I would want to keep my neighbors on good terms with me, and perhaps a country all the way across the world not necessarily as as important. Am I wrong? Is that just like an oversimplification?
Well, my tendency is to agree with you. But, you know, here we are. It was not so long ago that Turkey had good relations with all of its neighbors, Syria, Azerbaijan,
it's true,
Israel, and now they don't have good relations with any of them. And through no fault of their own, I think. When my article came out, Turkey was already on the road of having very poor relations with Azerbaijan, and the leadership in Turkey and Azerbaijan met. And the Turks said to the Azeris, to the Azerbaijanis, listen, my brothers, you have to consult with us in your relationship with Israel. And the Azeri leadership said, well, you're still our brothers, but we don't have to consult with you. So,
right.
You know, these are strong-willed countries. They have their own foreign policy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with Israel having a relationship with Azerbaijan. Countries have relationships with each other.
Of course.
The question here is, you know, is there more than just oil at stake? Israel needs oil. Nothing wrong with it getting oil from Azerbaijan. Is this a relationship that will lead to further stability in the region or instability? My problem with the relationship is the American military's problem with the relationship And the fact that Israeli leaders, Ephraim Snei, I quote in my article, saying this is an emergent democracy. Azerbaijan is a lot of things, but emerging democracy is not one of them. Well, and we need to have a clear-eyed view of what kind of a country this is and how it fits into the geopolitics of that region, and whether we as a country need to be allied with it in the same way Israel is. I don't think we do.
Well, Mark, what do you think Azerbaijan sees in terms of a possible strike in Iran? I have to ask you that. Do you think they actually think about it much? What does it mean for them?
I think that probably the last thing that Azerbaijan's leaders want is a general regional war. They have nothing to gain from it. But they have a lot to gain from being friends with Israel. Israel is a very good strategic ally to have. They have great technical expertise.
Right.
They can provide good weapons, some of the best weapons in the world. They have a great computer industry. They know how to run industries and can provide technical expertise to the petrochemical industry, which Azerbaijan desperately needs that kind of expertise.
Of course.
They have great intelligence agency, and Azerbaijan feels threatened in the intelligence field, and Israel has helped them. Baku is like Hong Kong during the Cold War, so they welcome Israeli expertise. They have a lot to gain, and the trade-off is easy. Access to an airfield in the wake of a strike is a very low price to pay. But to go so far as to be an actual participant in a war, I agree with our colleagues here that that's probably a bridge too far for them.
And let's also be clear that when Mark is saying that they have a lot to gain, he is talking about the Azeri government under Aliyev right now. He has a lot to gain. Yeah. The Azeri people do not have a lot to gain, if any, from this relationship with Israel, because it's a business and strategic relationship. It has nothing to do with the problems that they're facing and the problems that they will face if there is a regional war with Israel striking Iran.
Well, you know, sometimes our commenters put it perhaps very succinctly, even though you and Mark and Taufiq put it so eloquently throughout this conversation. W.T. Effington saying, oil, Iran, and Israel, you're screwed, Azerbaijan. Taufiq, you would agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I mean, you know, sad to say, nobody really cares about the Azerbaijani people in the geopolitical capitals of the world. It's not been about them. Not about them right now, and that's the unfortunate reality.
Well, it reminds me of the Syrian people. I would agree that the same applies for them, sadly. But to end on a positive note, how about we do that? I will thank you, Mark and Shireen and Taufiq, and I want to share with you that Striker22, 25 seconds ago, saying, I really enjoy these segments where the panelists actually have done their homework and do know what they're talking about. Also, thank you for not making it a screaming fest. I didn't have anything to scream about. But Mark, thank you so much for taking time and joining us. Shireen as well, and Taufiq over the phone. We appreciate you joining us, even if we had some internet troubles. Be sure to check out our green rooms above me if you're still watching. Above us, we have all of the upcoming stories. We have great stories and segments and conversations coming up, and we want you to participate in them. All of this, of course, courtesy of our founding partner, Cadillac.